Now, let me bring you up to date on the progress of this United Alternative idea, and I'll try and make the long story short. That idea of holding the big meeting was approved at our party convention in 1998. The first United Alternative Convention was consequently held in Ottawa on February 19 to 21, 1999. There were 1,500 delegates there. 55% of them were federal reformers, and we appreciate the people from this riding that made the effort to come all the way down there at their own expense and participate in this meeting. 45% of the delegates there were from other groups. There were about 10 groups represented at that meeting. The media focused on federal reformers and federal conservatives, and yes, they were there. But there were also representatives of the big governing provincial conservative parties, the Klein Conservatives, the Filmon Conservatives, the Harris Conservatives. There were also people from the Saskatchewan Party, which is an amalgam of reformers, liberals and conservatives, led by former Reform MP Elwyn Hermanson. And we hope Elwyn does well in the Saskatchewan election. It looks like he is going to do well. There were people there from Quebec that were discontented federalists and soft sovereigntists who are looking for a different option rather than separation or status quo federalism. There were provincial liberals there from British Columbia, where the provincial liberal parties alienated from the federal liberal party, as well as liberals from Toronto, and mainly friends of John Nunziata. The purpose of this meeting was to see if we could define principled ground on which to go further. And the convention did agree on these four big principles that I've mentioned to you, that we could agree, we might disagree on other things, but we could agree on fiscal responsibility, social responsibility as I've defined it, democratic accountability, and reform of the Federation. Reform then held an internal referendum to ask our members, should we proceed further with this idea? We got a majority of our members in a majority of the provinces, 60.5% in 8 out of 10 provinces, said yes, proceed. Proceed with caution, because we want to be careful we don't lose anything that we've worked so hard to achieve, but proceed. Why proceed? Because many of our reformers, and many of you in this room, and I see people who've been with us here for over 10 years, want to get the 150 plus members you need in a 301 chamber parliament to actually implement the things that we're talking about. Not just talk about them, not just criticize the other guys for not doing it, they're not going to do it anyway. Not just proposing alternatives to see them half stolen by the other people, but not all of them stolen, but to actually implement what we've been talking about. People say to me that they've got a commitment to these principles we're talking about. If we're committed to those principles, then we won't rest until they're implemented. You don't demonstrate your commitment to principle just by printing them in a book. You don't get them established just by making speeches, because if that would happen, I've made enough speeches to get them implemented 40 times over. You don't get any of the things that you believe in or have worked for, or that Rick works for, implemented in a federal democratic chamber of 301 members unless you got 150 plus members to stand up some night and do more than talk about these things, but actually vote for them. And that's what this United Alternative is an attempt to do. Now, what are we asking people to do? Or let me follow up. Since the internal referendum, the United Alternative Steering Committee has set up 8 action committees that were proposed at this convention. They include committees to develop a framework, to develop a policy package and an election strategy for the next election that would result in a single candidate in every one of those 301 ridings committed to these basic principles that I've discussed. These action committees are going to carry out grassroots consultations across the country. Some people say, well, how could you put this all together in a couple of years? Some of you that were at our first convention, Ray will remember this, at our first reform convention, in that little group, there were not connections in that group with more than 20 federal ridings. I wouldn't have guessed. At this meeting in Ottawa on February 19 to 21, if you went through that delegate list, the ridings they were from, the organizations they were connected with, in that one room alone, there were connections with somewhere between 240 and 270 federal ridings. That's why I don't think it would be impossible to put something together if those people were agreed in principle on what they wanted to do. These action committees will be consulting you. They'll be asking for your input. You can get all this information either through Rick or through the Constituency Association. We're selling reform memberships. And we say we got a 2-for-1 sale for you. You'll get everything that the official opposition is doing in Parliament, everything that Reform is doing, but you'll also get all the information you need on this United Alternative, plus an opportunity to vote on whether we proceed with it at the end or not. These action committees will be consulting with you, with others across the country. You'll have a chance to make your input in this whole process. And then their work will be brought together into a second United Alternative Convention, which will be held in Ottawa at the end of January next year. And that's when we'll see whether people from all across the country can agree on a set of policies and election strategy for the next election that will result in a single candidate in each of the 301 ridings committed to a set of principles and policies very close to what we've worked for years, and with a chance of electing the 150 plus members to the federal parliament. Now there's 4 things that you can do if you're interested in this at all. One is continue to support your official opposition members, and in this case, of course, it means Rick, and we've got other members here as well that appreciate your support, so that we can continue our job in the Parliament to hold the Liberals accountable and to present alternatives. Secondly, as I said, you can participate in the work of these action committees and help them put their work together. Thirdly, you can attend or help send delegates to this United Alternative Convention in Ottawa. And finally, you can make a judgment after this package has been all put together. Is this something you would be prepared to support in the next federal election? Are you prepared to make a super effort to go faster rather than slower and get 150 plus people in that parliament that will do some of the things that you've been talking about for a long time? Now, just 2 other things before I stop. The question, is this Reform-initiated United Alternative venture audacious, controversial, risky, and challenging? The answer to that question is yes, it is. It's audacious, controversial, risky, and challenging. Just like the original March West of the RCMP was audacious, controversial, risky, and challenging. Just like building the CPR was audacious, risky, challenging, and audacious. Just like the efforts of your forefathers and mine to open up the West was controversial, risky, audacious, etc., etc. What big idea in this country, from Confederation itself to starting reform to instituting Medicare, what big idea hasn't been controversial, risky, and challenging? That's the character of new and big ideas. But it shouldn't scare us away, in my judgment, from that idea. Why do we pursue it? For reasons not dissimilar to those that the pioneers of the Old West pursued their dreams. We pursue it, first of all, for economic reasons. We want more economic freedom. And in our day, that means freedom from excessive government taxation. And we're not going to get that kind of freedom unless we make some extraordinary effort. If you study the history of other countries, there's no country in the world where the government's taxation system became oppressive, where the government just gave it up because a few people said we're tired of it. In every country where that's been changed, it required a superhuman effort and for people to do things that they hadn't done before. So that's a good reason for pushing this. We're doing it for political reasons because we want more clout in the Parliament of the 21st century. And in the final analysis, I say we're pursuing this venture for a more fundamental reason, because it will result in a better Canada, not so much for us in this room, but for our children and our grandchildren. And if they ever ask us, as I expect they might do, what did you do for a Millennium Project? I want to say we began and completed a long march that went from the Old West to the New West to the new Canada of the 21st century. Thank you very much for your attention. Okay.